There's a lot of bad shit going on in the world right now. Lots of people are dying every day from a myriad of causes. Our global economic system seems to be pushing humanity to the brink of extinction, and Fall Out Boy just released an album of crappy EDM. All of these things are equally terrible. In all seriousness, though, things are kind of grim lately. Not that they haven't been for a long time, but you get my drift. Understandably, a lot of people aren't too pleased about this. In fact, a lot of people are really fucking angry about the way things are headed right now, especially in America. Reactions to some of the awful decisions made by the Trump administration are often quite vitriolic, especially on social media sites like Facebook and my personal favorite and least favorite at the same time, Twitter. Lots of profanity, lots of appeals to the emotions of the reader, and it seems like every time a left-wing person tries to bring attention to social injustices in a way that relies on these sorts of emotional appeals in any way, there's always someone on the other side to perceive their words as the incoherent ramblings of an impotent child, or in contemporary parlance, a triggered snowflake. There's a lot to unpack in these two words. Let's start with the latter. So, as we all hopefully know, snowflakes are these strange little ice crystals with deeply intricate structures, and no two snowflakes are exactly alike. It's not like me to start things off with science lessons, but there you go, that's the briefest possible summary of snowflakes. The idea that every snowflake has a unique shape is often used as a metaphor with young children to communicate the fact that we're all different in our own subtle ways. This concept was also of particular relevance to Chuck Palahniuk, the author of Fight Club, but in a much different way. In this book and in its film adaptation, there's a quote that goes something like this: "You are not special, you are not a beautiful and unique snowflake, you are the same decaying organic matter as everyone, and we are all part of the same compost pile." This quote is one of the basic tenets of the borderline fascist ideology of Project Mayhem, a terrorist organization in Fight Club whose members all seek the same sort of power, to the extent that they lose much of their individuality in the process of pursuing it. In the wake of the widespread popularity of the Fight Club movie, the term snowflake, often augmented with the word special, was used to refer to people with an overinflated sense of their own self-worth and supposedly unique qualities. Over time, the derogatory meaning of snowflake has expanded much further beyond this and has become particularly popular to describe the perceived attitude and outlook of the generation of younger people I just so happen to belong to. So, excuse my bias going forward. One of the most upvoted definitions of snowflake on Urban Dictionary defines snowflakes as extremist liberals that get offended by every statement and/or belief that doesn't exactly match their own. First of all, the conflation of extremist and liberal is pretty funny. Second of all, even disregarding the fact that "did you just assume my gender" is a transphobic meme, it's just not a very funny meme. Third, and most importantly, this is sort of the gist of the most popular current meaning of the term snowflake. In right-wing buzzword parlance, a snowflake is someone, usually a left-winger of some persuasion, who is perceived to be overly sensitive to the thoughts and opinions of other people, especially when those thoughts and opinions conflict with ones that the snowflake already holds. Even Mr. Fight Club himself has co-signed on this use of the term, going so far as to claim he invented this derogatory use of snowflake, which he didn't. More on that in a bit. This idea that left-wingers are intolerant of opposing views isn't really new. There's been a war on political correctness far longer than there's been a war on Generation Snowflake. However, there is a common thread here. Politically correct language and snowflake mentality are both seen by right-wingers as attacks on freedom of speech. You already know what I have to say to this, surely. Left-wing people using their freedom of speech to say that, for instance, there are more than two genders doesn't invalidate your right to say that there are only two genders. You can still say that there are only two genders, just don't be surprised when we tell you that you're demonstrably incorrect. When the right wing accosts leftists for their supposed intolerance of opposing views, they're just putting up a smokescreen. Saying there are only two genders, or that climate change isn't real, or that women or people of color or queer people or any other minority group aren't oppressed isn't an opposing view. An opposing view would be you and I having different favorite breakfast cereals. You don't view things like gender or climate science differently. You view them in ways which are inconsistent with widespread majority consensus. Simply put, you're wrong. Here's a bit of an aside to wrap this part up. The derogatory snowflake has an unexpected origin that far predates Fight Club. According to Merriam-Webster, in Missouri in the early 1860s, a snowflake was a person who was opposed to the abolition of slavery. The implication of the name being that such people valued white people over black people. This use of the term was short-lived, but it's still pretty funny when you think about the sorts of people this used to refer to compared to who it refers to now. Racist assholes against people who are often actively anti-racist. What a time to be alive. Now, the other piece of this puzzle is a bit more harrowing. This part of the video discusses trauma triggers. In keeping with the situation, I'm placing a warning here, as there will be brief mentions of multiple types of abuse, as well as mental illnesses and eating disorders. That brief word of caution I just offered you is something we call a trigger warning. People with certain mental disorders can have symptoms of their disorders activated by various stimuli which psychological professionals call trauma triggers, or triggers for short. Trigger warnings are a piece of caution which are most often seen at the beginning of online articles that are meant to help prevent people with these sorts of triggers from reliving traumatic life experiences after. They're very similar to the content warnings you see before movies and shows that play on television that warn viewers that what they're about to see may contain gratuitous sex or violence. Trigger warnings are somewhat different in that they often deal with much grittier subject matter, particularly physical, psychological, or sexual abuse. You may also see trigger warnings applied to discussions of weapons, eating disorders, mental illnesses such as depression, or various types of bigotry. What triggers one person may not trigger another, but trigger warnings are still used in many instances regardless of this. After all, a little bit of common courtesy never hurt anybody. And yet, a lot of people seem to despise trigger warnings with every fiber of their being. There are quite a few memes that make fun of the concept of trigger warnings, or even being triggered. Hell, the word triggered has even recently transcended beyond the simple bounds of right-wing talking points and has rather disgracefully become a synonym for having a negative reaction of any degree to something. Triggered is one of the most commonly used and abused words in YouTube cringe compilations, along with SJW, for instance. All this hubbub over a simple piece of courtesy. What the hell's going on here? Well, this is particularly relevant to the culture of the modern university, an institution long proclaimed by right-wingers to merely be a leftist indoctrination chamber. You see, in recent years there has been a trend among some university professors to include trigger warnings in their syllabi, to let students know ahead of time that the content of the classes they're teaching may potentially be upsetting in some way or another. For instance, a literature class dealing with Ovid's myths of Persephone and Daphne might contain a trigger warning in the syllabus for depictions of sexual assault and rape. If people who are against trigger warnings are to be believed, these trigger warnings in college settings are paramount to censorship and/or coddling of young adults. The argument goes that if we allow students to opt out of course materials that make them uncomfortable, that denies the people who wrote those materials their right to be heard and understood. Furthermore, allowing students to opt out of triggering materials will also leave those students completely unprepared to deal with the real world. This opposition to trigger warnings on campuses, similar to the opposition to campus safe spaces, the two go kind of hand in hand, is based in a fundamental misunderstanding of what they are and what their purpose is. A trigger warning's purpose in a college campus setting is to say to students that there will be discussion of topics which could possibly cause them to relive traumatic life experiences and to prepare accordingly. That's the key to all this, really, preparing accordingly. This is not the same as opting out. With trigger warnings in YouTube videos like this one, or in online articles, there is the possibility on behalf of the reader to say, okay, I'd better stay away from this for my own sake. But in a university setting, and I say this as someone who's almost 3 years deep into a degree, there's basically zero chance that you'll be able to opt out of certain course materials and get a perfect 4.0 in the class. Syllabus trigger warnings allow students to plan ahead for certain classes where particularly traumatic things will be discussed. Knowing well ahead of time that these discussions will take place allows students with trauma triggers to be better prepared to engage with course materials in a safe way. This isn't shielding students from the real world, whatever that means. I thought it would be obvious that the fact that there are students who experience triggering means that they're already pretty familiar with how shitty the real world can be. Finally, a note to people of any political persuasion who flippantly toss the word triggered around. Maybe don't. You're not triggered whenever somebody brings up the way you used to act in middle school. Literally everybody was a cringy little shit in middle school. And to some of my fellow leftists, Stop using this term back at the right wing like it's some sort of hilarious own. I've done this before myself, and I'm not proud of it. Right-wingers have already diluted the concept of trauma triggers enough. Us doing the same isn't gonna make things better. You want to call Tommy Lahren or Ben Shapiro a snowflake? Fine. At most, you'll offend the sensibilities of ICE. But let's not marginalize traumatized people in our pursuit against these assholes. This has gotta stop.